In the final weeks of May 2026, something changed irreversibly in Russia's war logistics inside occupied Ukrainian territory. Volodymyr Zelensky, standing before cameras in Kiev, declared that no road under Russian control was safe. And for the first time since the full-scale invasion began, operational data confirmed the statement was not rhetoric. It was a diagnosis. The numbers told the story with a precision that required no embellishment. According to estimates compiled by the Institute for the Study of War, the ISW, based in Washington, Ukraine had destroyed or severely damaged more than 370 Russian logistical nodes in the 4 months preceding that declaration alone. Ammunition depots, rear command centers, rail and road bridges, fuel terminals, and distribution hubs feeding the front lines from Zaporizhia to the Donbass. 370 logistical nodes is, in military terms, the equivalent of dismantling piece by piece the backbone that keeps an army of more than 300,000 soldiers fed, armed, and operational. Without that backbone, the body collapses, regardless of how many soldiers are sitting in the trenches. And here was the paradox that Kremlin planners had failed to calculate when they decided to turn the war into an industrial war of attrition. Russia had bet that its territorial depth and its capacity for mass munitions production would be enough to grind down Ukrainian resistance through sheer weight. The logic seemed ironclad. Whoever produces more shells and recruits more soldiers eventually prevails. But that logic rested on a silent assumption, that the path between the factory and the trench would remain intact. That assumption was being destroyed, kilometer by kilometer, by weapons that cost a fraction of what they were destroying. The weapon that most transformed this equation was not a fifth-generation fighter jet or an intercontinental ballistic missile. It was the HIMARS, the High Mobility Artillery Rocket System supplied by the United States, combined with precision-guided munitions such as the GMLRs and, more recently, the Attack-MS, tactical missiles capable of striking targets at distances exceeding 300 kilometers. A single HIMARS launcher truck cost approximately $5,400,000, less than the value of the cargo aboard a single Russian ammunition train destroyed by its rockets. The equation had shifted. But the true impact of this operation extended far beyond the numbers on the battlefield. What Ukraine was executing was not a campaign of isolated strikes. It was a systematic strategy of logistical interdiction, a military concept that means, in plain terms, severing the arteries that carry blood to the enemy army's body before that blood reaches the organs that depend on it. The doctrine was not new. What was new was the capacity of a country under invasion to execute it with surgical precision against the world's second-largest nuclear power, using Western technology integrated with signals intelligence and near real-time satellite imagery. Step back for a moment and take in the full picture. Before this campaign reached its most intense phase, Russian forward ammunition depots were operating at distances between 40 and 60 kilometers from the front lines, close enough to ensure rapid resupply of the artillery batteries, firing between 20,000 and 60,000 shells per day during peak intensity. After months of systematic HIMARS strikes, those depots were pushed beyond 150 kilometers from the line of contact, according to analyses from the British Ministry of Defense. That meant every Russian shell now had to travel 3 times the previous distance to reach the firing line, tripling transit time, tripling fuel consumption, tripling the exposure of supply convoys to further attacks along the route. In a moment, you will understand why this cascading effect altered not just the tactics, but the entire economic logic of the Russian war effort. In the shadow of this monumental strategic miscalculation, one actor was watching everything with calculated satisfaction. And here was the actor that headlines were not mentioning with the frequency the data deserved: China. Beijing did not need to fire a single round to benefit from Russia's logistical collapse. Each additional month of war meant Russia was selling oil and natural gas to China at discounts reaching 35% below international market prices. Discounts that, according to Bloomberg estimates, represented savings of more than $2 billion per quarter for Chinese refiners. China was buying Russian energy at liquidation prices while studying in real time how Western precision warfare was dismantling the logistics of a continental power. It was the most expensive lesson in history, and Beijing was watching for free. And here was the figure that conventional reporting was not displaying with the prominence it deserved. The estimated cost of Ukraine's logistical interdiction campaign, including HIMARS and ATACMS munitions, long-range drones and Storm Shadow missiles supplied by the United Kingdom, represented, according to calculations by the Royal United Services Institute, approximately 4% of the total value of the Russian equipment and supplies destroyed by those strikes. 4%. For every dollar invested by Ukraine and its Western allies in precision munitions, Russia lost the equivalent of $25 in materiel, fuel, ammunition, and logistics vehicles. Consider what that number means in practice. It was a destructive return ratio of 25-1, the kind of asymmetry that no war budget, however vast, can absorb indefinitely. The historical analogy that captures this dynamic most precisely is not the Battle of Britain, which many analysts invoked for its technological asymmetry. It is the Allied railway interdiction campaign ahead of D-Day in 1944, known as Operation Transportation. In that campaign, Allied bombers did not strike German troops directly. They struck the rails, the bridges, and the marshalling yards that fed the Reich's war machine across occupied France. The result was that when the landings came in Normandy, Germany's panzer divisions, the most feared in the European theater, could not reach the coastline in time because the system that moved them had been surgically disarticulated. Ukraine was applying that exact same logic 82 years later, with drones and guided missiles in place of strategic bombers. But there was one layer still untouched, and it changes the nature of this analysis entirely. The human dimension of this disarticulation had a face. General Andrei Sychevoy, commander of the Russian forces grouping on the Pokrovsk axis, a 57-year-old officer described by subordinates in intercepted communications as methodical and averse to unnecessary risk, was forced to redeploy frontline combat units to escort logistics convoys in the rear. This general is not the emotional protagonist of this analysis. He is the investigative coordinate for what logistical collapse does to the offensive capacity of an entire army. When you pull infantry battalions out of the trenches to protect ammunition trucks 150 kilometers from the line of contact, every escorted convoy is a weakened sector of the front. The attrition was not happening only in the trenches, it was happening on the roads. And the greatest paradox of the entire crisis was precisely here. The weapon the regime had unleashed to wound the enemy was, at that very moment, destroying its own revenue stream. Russia was financing the war with oil and gas revenues that depended on logistical infrastructure, pipelines, railways, port terminals, operating at the edge of capacity. Every locomotive diverted to carry ammunition to the front was a locomotive not carrying coal for export. Every railway bridge destroyed by Ukraine in Zaporizhzhia or Kherson was a bottleneck that delayed not only shells, but also commodity wagons feeding the Russian state's revenues. Russia's fiscal deficit, the gap between what the state collects and what it spends to sustain the war, had surpassed, according to data from Moscow's Ministry of Finance, 6% of GDP, the largest imbalance in more than 2 decades. Russia cannot sustain this hemorrhage indefinitely, and the end of that period will determine the future, not of one country, but of all of Europe. And here was what that layer revealed about the cascading effect mentioned earlier. The forced retreat of the depots did not merely triple resupply distances, it created an entirely new category of target. The truck convoys traveling 150 kilometers along exposed roads became vulnerable to a second generation of weapons that Ukraine had developed domestically. Long-range attack drones with a unit cost below $50,000, equipped with thermal cameras and the ability to operate at night. A single drone of that kind, costing less than a luxury automobile, was capable of destroying a truck loaded with ammunition valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars. The era of cheap feared attacks was over. The era of cheap, intelligent, and lethal defense had officially begun. And so we arrive at the question no analyst was answering with sufficient clarity. If Ukraine maintained that rate of logistical destruction over the following 6 months, and Western supplies of precision munitions showed no signs of slowing. Russia's capacity to sustain large-scale offensive operations would be mathematically compromised. Not for lack of soldiers, not for lack of political will in the Kremlin, but for lack of the most prosaic and most irreplaceable element of any prolonged war: the ability to deliver the right round to the right gun at the right moment. Without logistics, an army of 500,000 men is nothing more than an armed crowd waiting for supplies that never arrive. The board had been flipped. What Zelensky had declared was not a promise of victory. It was the recognition that the war had entered a phase in which roads, bridges, and rail lines were worth more than trenches, and that Ukraine had found the instrument to make every kilometer of Russian asphalt a calculated risk. The question that remains open is whether Moscow can reconfigure its logistics before the rate of destruction renders offensive operations unsustainable, and whether Washington and its European allies will maintain the flow of precision munitions that sustains this campaign through 2026 and beyond. The logistics clock was running, and it was running against Moscow. If this conflict is rewriting the rules of modern warfare before your eyes, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next chapter of this equation is already being written on the roads Russia can no longer protect.